If you help a stranger, sincerely, with no expectation of return, but all you receive is a locked door on a freezing night, would you still want to do the right thing ever again? Micah Brooks, 18 years old, orphaned, poor, with nothing left but one chance to keep his place to sleep for the night. And then he loses that chance, simply because he pulled over to help an elderly woman shivering alone by the roadside. No one knew that because of that act, Micah would not only lose his shelter, but almost lose his faith in human kindness. What he didn't realize was that the world had been quietly watching, and it would answer him in a way no one could have predicted. This isn't just a story about kindness. It's a journey through disappointment towards something far more beautiful than any reward. To be seen and valued as the person you truly are. If you've ever asked yourself, is it really worth it to be a good person? Stay with us until the end, because the answer just might make you believe again. Before we begin, please like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support is what helps us continue sharing powerful, soul-stirring stories like this one. Now let's begin. Eldon Ridge, a small northern town where winter comes early and stays longer than anyone would like. Dusk had just fallen. Snow had not yet come, but the cold was already in the bones. The sun dipped behind rows of weathered brick buildings, leaving streaks of fading amber light gliding across streets slick with mist. Wind howled down narrow alleys, slipped beneath crumbling eaves, and crept into the collars of those hurrying home. Amid it all, a young man pedaled an old bicycle through the streets. The paint chipped, the chain groaning with every turn. This was Micah Brooks, 18 years old, orphaned at 14, living off odd delivery jobs. On his shoulder was a canvas bag with the last order of the day. If he delivered it on time, he'd have just enough for a night's stay. If not, there would be no roof in Eldon Ridge open to him tonight. The bike had once belonged to his mother. It had taken her to work, carried him to school, and now it was his only bridge to survival. Micah hunched forward, pushing into the wind. One quiet mantra replayed in his mind: do the right thing. Stay kind. Things will work out. He'd believed that since he was small. Even when life hadn't been kind, Micah clung to goodness the way someone clings to the last bit of warmth in a bitter winter. And he didn't yet know that just a few blocks ahead, that belief was about to be tested like never before. At the far end of a narrow street on the outskirts of Eldon Ridge, where a flickering street lamp fought to stay lit against the cold, stood an old bus stop. A rotting wooden bench, a faded route sign like a half-erased memory, and the silent figure of an elderly woman, standing alone in the biting wind. Margaret Whitmore, silver hair tied back with a worn silk scarf, arms clutching a scuffed leather bag, and wrapped in a coat that looked heavier than she did, was gazing down a road where no bus would ever come. Her lips moved softly, repeating a few names over and over. Elmshade Road. Number 12. Is that the right direction? People passed quickly. Some glanced her way, then looked off. Some paused for a heartbeat, but moved on, leaving her behind like a winter ghost, slowly fading into the cold. Micah was turning down the intersection when he saw her. He almost sped past. The clock in his pocket read 7:50. 10 more minutes late and he'd lose the final delivery. And with it, the thin mattress in the corner room he called home. But something about her made him stop. Not her appearance, but her disorientation. A person no longer sure of where she needed to be, left behind by a world spinning too fast to care. Micah pulled to a stop, stepped off his bike, and wheeled it beside him as he walked closer. "Good evening, Mom. Do you need help?" Margaret turned slowly. Her eyes, clouded with age, blinked once. Then she gave a faint, grateful smile. "I think I missed my bus. Or maybe it missed me. Do you know Elmshade Road?" Micah froze. Elmshade Road didn't exist in Eldon Ridge. He would know. He had delivered to every corner of this town. But he didn't let go. He nodded gently. "That's okay, Mom. We'll find it together." In the distance, a bus rolled past, its lights cutting briefly through the dusk. But Margaret didn't turn, and Micah knew the dream of a warm room tonight had likely just driven off in that bus's wake. Micah tightened the straps on his backpack, wrapped Margaret's frayed wool scarf more snugly around her neck, and slowly wheeled his bike away from the stop. No one spoke, no one looked back. Only the faint clatter of the iron wheels over cold gravel and the wind whistling past their ears, reminding them that time was passing. The old bicycle, once his mother's, had now become a humble carriage for the longest ride Micah had ever taken in his life. 14 Briar Glen Terrace. The name surfaced in his memory when he caught a glimpse of it engraved faintly on the back of Margaret's silver pendant. It was a place far out in the Hill District, nearly 2 hours by bike, most of it uphill, and the sky was already darkening. Micah didn't question it, didn't complain. He tightened the delivery bag still strapped to his back, took off his coat and gently draped it over Margaret, then helped her settle on the rear rack, padded with the old cloth he usually used to wipe his tires. "We'll take it slow, okay, Mom?" Micah's voice was steady, his hands firm on the handlebars. "I've never been there before, but we'll get there." Margaret smiled faintly. "My grandson used to say that too, though he never knew how to slow down." Micah didn't correct her, didn't say he wasn't her grandson, because for the first time in years, someone looked at him like family. He pedaled on. Up weary hills, over frozen stretches, through patches of darkness with no streetlights, and every time she asked, "Where are we going again?" he would gently answer, "Almost there, Mom. Just trust me." They stopped once, at a lonely gas station on the edge of town. Micah bought her a cup of hot tea with his very last dollar, and when she offered, "You drink first," he laughed. Not because of the tea, but because those words sounded exactly like his mother's. Once upon a time. By the time they arrived at the faded white gate of 14 Briar Glen Terrace, it was 9:30 p.m. Micah's legs were numb as he brought the bike to a stop. His hands frozen, lips cracked, chest heaving. But in his heart, there was something else, something the wind couldn't steal. He had kept his word and brought a stranger home. Micah left 14 Briar Glen Terrace with slow steps, but a light heart. He didn't ask for anything, didn't expect anything in return. All he felt was a quiet warmth from seeing Margaret smile. Her eyes were still a little lost, but now there was peace in them. He coasted down the hill into the night, the tires of his bike humming against the pavement in steady rhythm, like a heartbeat at rest. The wind grew sharper, colder, and in the bag slung over his back, the final delivery of the day sat, now past its promised time, along with the fragile hope of having a bed tonight. As he turned onto the narrow street that led to Dean's corner store, Micah saw the faint porch light from afar. The same soft glow he saw every night. But tonight, it didn't feel like it was waiting for him. He stopped at the bottom step. The wind sliced through the seams of his coat, chilling him to the spine. On the doorstep was a torn plastic bag holding a few worn items: a thin shirt, a face towel, a frayed phone charger. It was all bundled together like a quiet rejection. Next to it, taped to the door with moisture-stained adhesive, was a damp note written in thick black marker. Past due, locked out. Micah stood still. He didn't knock. He didn't cry. He just stared at the bag and the message for a long time. Then slowly sat down on the cold stone step. It wasn't the freezing air. It wasn't the locked door. It was something else, something sharper, twisting inside his chest. A question surfaced in his mind, louder than ever before. I did the right thing, but what did it cost me? Cold, hunger, and being left out like something no one needs. So what does being good even mean? The night in Eldon Ridge grew colder by the hour, but inside Micah, the coldest thing wasn't the wind. It was the first crack in a belief he had held onto for so long, a belief that goodness, someday, would be enough. Micah sat curled up on the doorstep for a few more minutes, or maybe hours, he couldn't tell anymore. The Eldon Ridge night didn't howl, but it crept in like cold needles pressing into his bones. Even the porch light above him began to flicker, as if it too wanted to give up. He was about to get up and wander aimlessly into the dark when the door behind him suddenly creaked open. A wave of warmth and the smell of old wood and strong coffee spilled into the cold. There stood Mr. Franklin Dean, owner of Dean's Corner Store, in a thick wool sweater, fuzzy slippers, and eyes that were half asleep, half knowing. He glanced at the bag of belongings, then looked at Micah. You missed rent, huh? Micah nodded, said nothing. Mr. Dean sighed. It wasn't a judgmental sigh, it was more like, I've been there too. Then he opened the door wider and stepped aside. Storage room in the back. No fancy heater, but the roof doesn't leak. There's an old blanket on the top shelf. Don't touch the wine. Anything else, if it helps you make it through the night, it's yours. Micah froze for a second, not because he was surprised, but because he recognized it. That kind of help, the kind that doesn't ask too many questions. He bowed his head. Thank you, sir. Mr. Dean just nodded. Don't freeze to death, all right? I don't feel like filing a corpse report first thing in the morning. The back door leading to the stockroom shut behind him. No bolt, no lock. In that small space filled with cardboard boxes, dried oranges and dusty tins, Micah wrapped the thin blanket around his shoulders and curled up on a makeshift mattress pieced together from flattened shipping pads. No one said a prayer. There was no moral of the story, no divine beam of light from above. Just a tired young man who had once believed in goodness, curled up in a cold storeroom, trying to hold on to the last bit of warmth he could find. The quiet kindness of someone who didn't need to know why. Only that someone needed a place to survive the night. That night, Eldon Ridge grew so cold that the fog frosted the warehouse window panes in a dull white blur. Wind seeped through the wooden slats, slicing through the thin blanket like it was testing the limits of an 18-year-old boy. To see what was left of him after a day spent giving up both dinner and shelter for a stranger. Micah couldn't sleep. He lay on his side atop a sack of grain, hugging his old coat like a pillow. His breath curled in soft grey wisps, lit faintly by a dying yellow bulb above the door. No one scolded him for helping the old woman. No one punished him. But worse, no one cared. And that's what hurt the most. In the dark, Micah whispered to himself, if doing the right thing leads to this, was it worth it? Outside, the trees whispered in the wind, but inside him something else cracked. Not his bones, something deeper. His faith. No one had ever told Micah the world was unfair, but a freezing floor, a dinner made of breath, and a locked door had taught him that lesson. No curriculum required. No one had to shout it. He pulled the blanket over his face, trying to stop a tear, not because of the cold, but because he was asking himself something he had never dared ask before. Was I a fool to believe that being kind would get me anywhere? And in the corner of the room, beside a box of withered apples, a sliver of moonlight caught the edge of an old tag. Dean's Market. It had been left by Mr. Franklin, scrawled in crooked handwriting. Just one line. This place isn't much, not warm, not big. But if you're still kind, there's room for you. Micah stared at that note for a long time, before finally closing his eyes. Not because he stopped feeling cold, but because he hadn't stopped believing just yet. The next morning, Eldon Ridge was still blanketed in mist. A pale sliver of sunlight crept across the roof of Dean's corner store. Micah was quietly sweeping dust in the back storeroom, his hands cracked from the cold, his eyes still swollen from a night without sleep. The front doorbell rang, but not the usual hurried ting he heard every morning. This chime was slower, deeper, heavier, as if every second of it carried weight. Micah stepped out to the counter and froze. Parked in front of the store was a sleek black car, the kind he'd only seen in old movies on late-night TV. The door opened. A tall man in a long overcoat stepped out, poised and composed, his silver-streaked hair impeccably neat. The man didn't enter right away. He stood outside the glass door, looking in, with the calm gaze of someone who already knew exactly where Micah would be. Micah's grip on the broom handle tightened. The man pushed the door open. Cold wind slipped in behind him, like it had followed on purpose. He smiled politely, his voice low and deliberate. "Are you Micah Brooks?" Micah nodded, cautious. "I am. Is something wrong, sir?" The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small scrap of paper. The very receipt Micah had scribbled his phone number on, the night he left 14 Briar Glen Terrace. "My name is David Langston. I'm an assistant to Mrs. Margaret Whitmore. She remembers everything, and she wanted to thank you," in her own words. The room seemed to still. From behind the counter, Mr. Franklin looked up, eyes narrowing slightly with age, but saying nothing. Micah stared at the slip of paper in David's hand, then at the man's polished shoes, then down at himself. His patched coat, frayed jeans, shoes that hadn't kept out the snow in weeks. "I'm not sure. Maybe you've got the wrong person." Micah stepped back slightly, unsure. David shook his head slowly. "Not at all. Mrs. Whitmore remembers every turn you took, every word you said. You didn't just help her find her way home. You helped her find a part of herself." Micah said nothing. Inside him, emotions flooded back. The cold, the exhaustion, the look from last night when the whole world had shut its door on him. And now this man had come to say he mattered. He didn't believe it. Couldn't. But David didn't press. He simply added, "We're not here to repay a favor. We're here because Mrs. Whitmore believes this. Good people need to be held on to before the world forces them to forget who they are." Micah's fingers curled tightly around the broom's handle. His eyes shifted, uncertain. A question hovered on his lips. But it wasn't time yet. The door was still open, and the car was still waiting. Micah didn't step out of the store right away. He stood behind the old counter, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, head slightly bowed. As if bracing himself not against the wind outside, but the storm still churning inside his chest. David Langston remained by the car. He didn't honk, didn't call out. He simply stood beside the open door, watching with the patient gaze of someone who had seen this moment play out many times. The moment when someone the world had once cast aside couldn't quite believe kindness was real. From behind the counter, Franklin Dean, the old shopkeeper, spoke without looking up. "You think they're not sincere?" Micah didn't answer immediately. Then, after a pause, he said quietly, "I didn't help her for a reward, but I didn't think doing the right thing would mean sleeping in a freezing storeroom, alone." Franklin nodded, his voice gravelly but steady. "Not everyone kind gets lucky, Micah. But if you stop being kind, then the rest of them win." Micah stayed silent, his eyes fixed on the faded Dean's Corner Store sticker peeling off the glass door. Yesterday it was an escape. Today, it was proof that he'd had nowhere else to go. "I don't want to get in that car and find out it was all a test. I don't think I've got enough left in me for one more disappointment." There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, just sadness. The kind that lives in people who once believed and were betrayed by their own belief. Outside, David didn't move closer, but his voice drifted through the cracked window. "You don't have to trust me. But Mrs. Margaret does. Not because of who you are or what you did, but because, while everyone else walked away, you were the one who stopped." Micah looked up. David continued, his voice slow and deliberate, like someone trying to guide a soul caught between pain and hope. "She doesn't call this repayment. She calls it an invitation to live by your own light, without having to freeze alone in the dark anymore." Micah looked outside. The car was still there. The man was still waiting. And in the distance, the first light of morning cut through the mist, casting a faint glow on the road that led back toward 14 Briar Glen Terrace. The road Micah had once pedaled for 2 hours, just to answer a trembling cry for help. He drew a deep breath, not to decide, but to prepare for something that might just be a beginning. Micah stepped out of the store, his back still slightly hunched, as if trying to hold on to the last warmth of the storeroom he'd slept in. The sleek black car was still parked by the curb, unmoving, but David Langston had already opened the back door. As if he'd known Micah would come, Micah stood there, the morning breeze brushing through his unkempt hair. He looked at David, not speaking right away. Finally, he shook his head gently. "I'm not sure I'm ready to step into a place where I might not belong." David wasn't surprised. He simply smiled, not a persuasive smile, but one of quiet relief, as if grateful Micah had dared to say what was real. "And that," David said, "is exactly why Mrs. Margaret wants you to come." Micah furrowed his brow. David slowly shut the car door and walked toward him, hands in his coat pockets, voice calm and steady. "You thought you were just helping an old woman get home, didn't you? But you didn't know. You were bringing a soul back to herself." Micah blinked. David looked him in the eye, his words like a message carried from far away. "She spent a lifetime in that mansion, with wealth, with status. But never once had someone guide her home. Not for power, not for legacy, but simply because someone believed she deserved to feel safe. You did that." Micah tightened the strap on his backpack. On one side, cold pavement. On the other, a leather seat. One side, doubt. The other, a chance he hadn't dared name. "I just did the right thing," Micah murmured. "And that right thing," David interrupted softly, "rekindled a soul that was nearly gone dark." In that moment, the morning sun broke through Eldon Ridge. The cold didn't vanish, but suddenly it didn't feel strong enough to make him shiver anymore. Micah didn't nod. He didn't say yes. He just stepped toward the car, slowly but with quiet resolve. David opened the door. He asked nothing more. Before sliding into the seat, Micah turned his head and looked back at Dean's corner store. Franklin Dean stood by the window, coffee in hand. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. But his eyes, for the first time, held hope. Micah whispered to himself words no one else could hear. "All right, this time I'll try to believe again." And the car pulled away, not carrying a delivery boy, but a heart that had once frozen over, now quietly burning again with the smallest, most sacred thing of all, restored faith. The car glided along the winding roads that edged the town of Eldon Ridge. Daylight filtered through sparse winter branches, casting soft streaks of light across the pavement, like the quiet whispers of memory. Micah sat silently in the back seat, hands resting on his knees, posture straight as if bracing himself. But inside, a storm, confusion, hesitation, and no small amount of fear. The ivory-white gates of 14 Briar Glen Terrace appeared around a bend. Faded paint, ivy curling around the fence, and behind it the house stood tall, still and solemn like something out of a fairy tale. But Micah knew there was no queen inside, only a woman with clouded eyes who had once said, "You remind me so much of my grandson." David said nothing as the car came to a stop. He simply opened the door and nodded gently. Micah stepped out, his worn shoes brushing the stone driveway, footsteps quiet beneath the high eaves. A housekeeper opened the front door and led him through a deep green carpeted hallway, past oil paintings and dark wooden bookshelves, into a room with wide glass doors overlooking a bare rose garden. There, as seated upright in a wingback chair, was Margaret Whitmore. Gone was the confusion in her eyes. Gone was the tattered headscarf. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, her hands folded gently, a silver brooch catching the noonday sun. When Micah entered, she looked up, and her gaze, steady and clear, seemed to recognize something long lost. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask, "Do you remember me?" She stood, slowly, her hands trembling but sure, and spoke in a voice soft yet unshakable. "You are the only person who made me feel human again." Micah froze. His eyes blinked once, not out of surprise, but because his heart had just stirred after days of silence. Margaret stepped forward and took his hand, a hand warm, real, pulsing with life and gratitude. "I've lived more than half my life with titles and estates," she said quietly. "But that night I realized this. It was a boy with worn shoes and eyes free of judgment who made me feel like I had truly come home." Micah bowed his head, something swelling in his chest, something he couldn't name. "I didn't think I did anything important," he murmured. Margaret smiled. "Sometimes the most important thing is simply stopping for someone the world has forgotten." The room fell into silence. Outside, the wind passed through brittle branches, gently setting the wind chime by the window into motion. And for the first time since his mother passed, Micah felt truly seen. Not for his face, not out of pity, but because he had chosen to do what was right. And someone had finally understood just how rare and sacred that choice was. Inside the quiet of 14 Briar Glen Terrace, the room seemed to still after Margaret's words of gratitude. Micah stood there, her hand still in his, unsure of what else to say. Every word suddenly felt clumsy in the face of kindness, that asked for nothing, expected nothing in return. Margaret gently let go of his hand and turned toward a small tea table by the tall glass window. On it rested a thick stack of paper bound by a dark indigo ribbon and a teacup still steaming. She picked up the stack and offered it to Micah. "This isn't a contract. It's not an adoption form. There are no clauses, no timelines. It's just an invitation." Micah looked down. The pages were written by hand in blue ink. The script delicate with the tremble of age, but precise, filled with intent and sincerity. "I, Margaret Whitmore, invite Micah Brooks to reside at my personal home, without obligation, without cost, until such time as he feels ready to take the next step in his life. If he wishes to continue his education, I am happy to support him." Micah looked up, uncertainty written across his face. "You wrote this because you believed I'd come?" Margaret smiled gently, placing a hand on his shoulder, like a real grandmother might. I wrote it because I hoped you'd stop believing your kindness was meaningless." Micah stood in silence for a long while. Inside him, something loosened, like frost quietly melting around a belief that had been frozen since the night he slept on a warehouse floor, discarded and unseen. "I used to think, if I never expected anything, I'd never be disappointed." Margaret nodded slowly, then replied at once, "I used to think that too, until you stopped for a stranger in the cold, simply because you couldn't bear to walk away. There were no obligations, no public recognition, just a space where someone could live as themselves and be seen as someone who mattered." Micah gave a small nod. He didn't say yes, but somewhere within, the walls of doubt were cracking, just enough for the first light to slip through. Margaret poured more tea, her voice soft as morning sun. "This house has far too many empty rooms, and I don't want them to remain rooms filled only with silence." Micah moved into 14 Briar Glen Terrace on a pale blue afternoon, the breeze drifting gently through the tree arches lining the driveway. There was no grand welcome, no cameras flashing, no one offering congratulations. Only Margaret Whitmore stood waiting on the front steps, her hand resting on the weathered wooden frame, but her eyes full of warmth. "Your room's on the second floor, facing south, where the morning sun hits first. I thought, you deserve to start your days like that." Micah carried only a small backpack and his worn-out bicycle. But when he stepped into the room she'd prepared, warm blankets, a study desk, an armchair by the window, and an empty bookshelf waiting to be filled, he understood. This wasn't just a place to stay. It was an unspoken, yet undeniable declaration that he belonged in the world, with full dignity. A week later, Margaret called him into the study. On the table, beside a sketched layout for a new community space, were freshly written words: "Silver Path Foundation, for young people who need a foothold, for the elderly who need a friend." "You once helped someone the world had nearly forgotten," she said. "Now I want you to help me build something, so no one else ever gets left behind." Micah stared at the blueprint in quiet disbelief. A support network for unhoused youth, a care initiative for elderly individuals living alone, a small community center led by people who understood firsthand what it meant to be lost, overlooked, and invisible. "It's called Silver Path," she added, "because that night, when I saw you cycling through the cold to bring me home, the moonlight caught your hair like the first strand of silver in someone finally coming of age." Micah didn't say anything in return, but that night he sat in his room, no textbooks open, no music playing. He just gazed out the window, where the dim lights of Eldon Ridge flickered softly beneath the early mist. From a damp storage room, from a rusted bicycle, to a bedroom with books, candlelight, and someone who believed in him. Not because he was extraordinary, but because he didn't walk away when everyone else did. A small corner, yes, but enough to change a whole life. Though Micah Brooks now lived at Briar Glen Terrace, with his own room, new books, 3 warm meals a day, and nights no longer spent wrestling with the cold, he held on to one unshakable habit. Every Saturday morning, he would ride his old bicycle, the one that once belonged to his mother, down into town. Not to show off, not to inspire anyone, but to preserve the thread between who he was now and the boy who once slept on the warehouse floor, clutching the last edible loaf of bread. He always stopped by Dean's corner store, helping Mr. Franklin Dean restock crates, wipe down dusty shelves, and in return received a cup of hot tea. Mr. Dean still didn't say much. "You still remember what cold feels like on your back, huh?" Micah would just smile, then push his bike down familiar alleyways, stopping by a few elderly residents in the North Side neighborhood, bringing medicine, snacks, and something even more valuable, his time. He didn't avert anyone's gaze. He didn't seek admiration. He simply lived as a fuller version of the boy he once was. Still quiet, still attentive, but now strong enough to reach out and catch others before they fell the way he once had. One afternoon, just as the sun dipped behind the hills of Briar Glen Terrace, golden light spilled through the living room windows, bathing everything in a quiet amber warmth. Margaret Whitmore sat in her favorite armchair, knitting. Micah Brooks sat on the floor, reviewing next quarter's plan for the Silver Path Foundation. They didn't speak much, they simply shared silence, the rare kind of silence that feels full because someone else is there to share it. Suddenly, Margaret looked up, her eyes deep but steady. "Micah, you're not staff, not someone indebted, not a lucky case. You're family." Micah looked up, slightly caught off guard. He smiled gently, but didn't answer right away. Margaret continued, her voice both steady and delicate. "I used to think, after losing my husband, my grandson, that the warm part of my life had gone with them. But then you came, no knocking, no asking, just stopping. And in that moment I realized, happiness isn't about what you have. It's about who you still have." Micah didn't know how to respond. He just nodded quietly, because to him, hearing those words was a gift greater than any mansion or scholarship. Later that evening, they walked together through the back garden, no longer a billionaire and a boy from the margins, just 2 people who had lost, and now had each other, so they wouldn't be lost again. That morning, Eldon Ridge was quietly bathed in sunlight, as if winter had never existed. Micah Brooks rode the same old bike, still his mother's, still rattling with its worn-out chain and chipped silver paint. But this time, he wasn't riding it out of necessity. He was riding it because he chose to return. The bike came to a slow stop at a place long forgotten by the town, the old bus stop at the end of Elmshade Road, the place where everything began. The wooden bench was still peeling, the route sign still broken at the corner, and the lamp post still flickered with every gust of wind. But today Micah didn't see it as sad. Today he stood there, as someone who had once been lost and found his way back. He took out a small sign and carefully pinned it to the wooden post beside the bench. Written in clear, hand-lettered black ink, it read, "If you're feeling lost, stay still. Someone will stop for you." A young schoolgirl passing by glanced at the sign and asked, Who did you write that for? Micah smiled, looking up at the sky now breaking open with golden light. For myself, from a long time ago. Then he returned to his bike and began to ride again. Not to escape, but to continue. Behind him, the bus stop was no longer just a place of waiting. It was now a place where something kind had once been planted. And ahead of him, Silver Path Foundation awaited, alongside Margaret and others who had chosen to believe in goodness. Even if it began with nothing more than a glance, a question, or a turn of bike wheels through winter wind, not every good person is rewarded. Not every kind act is applauded, and not everyone who chooses to do the right thing is embraced by the world right away. But sometimes the goodness you plant in the world returns, not with trumpets, but through quiet change in someone else's heart. Micah Brooks didn't become a hero because he gave an old woman a ride home. He became the one who changed an entire system. Because he dared to keep believing, even when there was no reason left to. We've all lived through winters like that. A moment when kindness isn't returned, and the question echoes inside, was I foolish for doing the right thing? But if each of us chooses to hold on to just a little light, the world becomes just a bit less cold. And who knows? Someone, somewhere, might just stop their bike for you too. What about you? Have you ever chosen to do the right thing, even when you knew it would cost you something? Share your story with us, because your light may be the one that guides someone else through the dark. Don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe to our channel to help spread more stories that truly touch the heart. And let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today?